In this video, we're going to learn to identify the rest of the skeletal muscles on the body. We will start with the muscles of the upper arm. Specifically on the upper arm, we have three muscles that we need to be aware of. We have the triceps brachii, the biceps brachii, and the brachialis muscle. Now, all of these muscles have one thing in common in that they are all named based on their location. Hopefully you remember, the brachial region refers to the upper arm. So therefore, that regional name makes its way into these three muscular names. So the triceps brachii here is indicating that we're on the arm. We have the biceps brachii and the brachialis. So all of these names in some way indicate the location of the muscle. But we also here see that we have the triceps and the biceps brachii. This in particular refers to the number of origins that these muscles have. The biceps brachii will have 2 origins, and the triceps brachii will have 3 origins. I have mentioned the biceps and the triceps brachii before, but let's go into the picture and see where these muscles can be found. As always, before we start identifying muscles, orientation is key. We have to make sure that we're looking at the right side of the body. So first and foremost, we see that this is the anterior side of the body, and this is the posterior side. And we can see these muscles over here are the muscles of the back, and the muscles here are the muscles of the chest. So specifically for the upper arm, we have the biceps brachii, which can be found anteriorly, and we'll also find the brachialis muscle, which is also found anteriorly, but under the biceps brachii. It's actually quite difficult to see unless you've removed the biceps brachii. So if you ever see the biceps brachii in particular, and I'm pointing to a muscle in this region, but the arrow is not smack dab in the middle of the biceps brachii muscle, you can probably deduce that I'm pointing to the brachialis. You can see that both of these arrows are pointing to the muscle that sits under the biceps brachii in particular. This picture just shows you what the brachialis muscle looks like with the biceps brachii removed. We can see that it's found attaching up here at the diaphysis of the humerus and then down here at the ulna. It's much easier to see this muscle when the biceps brachii isn't in the way. So the biceps brachii muscle found on the anterior side of the arm is primarily responsible for flexion of the arm. It's going to help bring our hand closer to the shoulder. And on the posterior side here, we'll also see the triceps brachii, and you can also see that this muscle is going to have several origins. We have one origin here, and there's one that's found back here. Both the biceps and the triceps brachii muscles will only have one insertion. We'll see that this is the insertion of the triceps brachii, and the biceps brachii is going to be down here, specifically at the radial tuberosity. The triceps brachii is the antagonist to the biceps brachii, and therefore the triceps is primarily responsible for the extension of the arm. The triceps brachii is quite a bit bigger than the biceps brachii is, in that this takes up the majority of the mass of the arm, and the biceps brachii will take up just about the rest. So the triceps brachii is found on the posterior arm, and the biceps brachii is found on the anterior arm. And don't forget about the brachialis, which sits just deep to the biceps brachii. So the muscles of the upper arm are quite straightforward. We're going to now move into the muscles of the abdominal wall. There are 4 muscles that comprise the abdominal wall, namely the rectus abdominis, the external oblique, the internal obliques, and the transversus abdominis muscles. Both the rectus abdominis and the transversus abdominis are named based on their location, as they are found in the abdominal region. The names of the internal and external obliques more so refer to the direction of the muscle fibers. Those muscle fibers will course in a diagonal direction. However, the direction of the fibers of the external oblique are different from that of the fibers on the internal oblique. Let's take a look at these muscles on the abdominal wall. The 4 muscles of the abdominal wall lay next to each other. And truly, there's 3 planes in which these muscles sit within. Out here we have our external oblique, and then on the middle plane we'll find the internal oblique and the rectus abdominis, and then just deep to those we'll find the transversus abdominis. At first glance, these muscles seem like they're very, very difficult to distinguish from each other. However, there is one trick that you can use to easily identify all 4 of these muscles. In order to tell these muscles apart, you want to look at the direction of the muscle fibers. Let's go from superficial to deep. So of all of these muscles, the external oblique is the most superficial. And you can see its fibers are running in this direction. And over here we also see the external oblique on this side, and these fibers will run in the opposite direction on the opposite side of the body. The muscle fibers of the external oblique point towards the groin. The way we describe muscle fibers in this orientation is superior lateral to inferior medial. Towards the top side of those muscle fibers, they're more laterally located, and they'll eventually become more medial as they become more inferior. So therefore, we describe the orientation of the muscle fibers of the external oblique as superior lateral to inferior medial. Now let's also take a look at the internal oblique here. These muscle fibers are actually coursing in the opposite direction. You'll see that this muscle in here is the internal oblique, and its muscle fibers are coursing perpendicular to that of the external oblique. We'll go ahead and draw in a line over here so you can see that both of the external obliques will contain muscle fibers that course from superior lateral to inferior medial. But the internal oblique that sits just under the external oblique will have muscle fibers that course from superior medial to inferior lateral. That's what we see with this muscle right here. The internal oblique sits just under the external oblique, and it's attached in the same plane as the rectus abdominis. Now, the rectus abdominis gets its name because it's found here in the abdominal region, but we also call it rectus because these muscle fibers are oriented vertically when our body is erect. So far, we've got superior lateral to inferior medial muscle fiber arrangements for the external oblique. For our internal obliques, we have the arrangement which is superior medial to inferior lateral, and then we have superior to inferior with our rectus abdominis. The transversus abdominis is also going to have a different arrangement than the rest of these muscles too. The transversus abdominis gets its name because its muscle fibers will course lateral to medial. Essentially, that's why we call this muscle the transversus, because these muscle fibers are coursing transversely across the body. And of course, we use abdominis because this is also found in the abdominal region. The reason that we call these internal and external oblique muscles is because an oblique plane goes diagonally through a part of the body. And because of this muscle fiber arrangement, you can see where they got their names. This is another really nice picture to show you the fiber orientation of the muscles of the abdominal wall. Here you can see the external oblique whose fibers course superior lateral to inferior medial. Again, it's called oblique because these muscle fibers are diagonally oriented. Here you see your internal obliques, which will course perpendicularly to the external oblique fibers. These fibers in particular course superior medial to inferior lateral. And this muscle lies in the same plane as the rectus abdominis muscle, whose fibers course superior to inferior. And we'll also have the transversus abdominis, whose fibers course lateral to medial. Hence its name as the transversus. So out of all of the muscles that make up the abdominal wall, the external oblique is the most superficial. It will lie just on top of the internal oblique, whose fibers are oriented in the opposite direction as the external obliques. And the rectus abdominis is right next to the internal oblique, coursing up the entire length of the abdomen. Once these three other muscles have been removed, we're able to see the transversus abdominis, whose muscle fibers really give us the insight on why we called it the transversus abdominis muscle. One other quick note that I want to mention about this picture is that the muscles of the abdominal wall are not the only muscles that we can actually see on this picture. On tests and quizzes, you may have to identify these muscles on other models than the ones that I give you on these slides. You will need to be able to translate this information that you're learning to different pictures. So in particular, with this picture, you can see that this muscle up here is one that we've already learned. This is the pectoralis major muscle. So we've already seen this one as part of the muscles of the chest. But there's another chest muscle that we can see here also, and it is shown over here. This muscle that looks rather serrated is the serratus anterior muscle, and we can see it coming around the anterior side of the chest. So both of these are chest muscles that can also be seen in this picture as well. Additionally, we have this muscle over here, which looks rather small from this view, but from the back side of the body, it's actually quite large. This muscle is known as the latissimus dorsi, so this is actually one of our larger muscles that can be found on the back. Based on where this muscle inserts, We're going to be able to see this muscle in this view in particular. And lots of muscles are able to be seen in many different views. So make sure that regardless of the picture, you know where these muscles are in comparison to each other. We're also going to transition into the gluteal region, which will give us 3 more muscles. In particular, we have the gluteus maximus, the gluteus medius, and the tensor fasciae latae. The gluteus maximus and the gluteus medius muscles are named both based on their size and on their location. I'm sure you can see how gluteus refers to the gluteal region. However, maximus and medius are going to indicate the size of each of these muscles. And even though it's not on the slides and you won't have to know this for the exam, there's also a gluteus minimus muscle as well, and that muscle is smaller than the gluteus medius will be. We call this the gluteus medius in particular because its size is in between that of the gluteus minimus and the gluteus maximus. The gluteus maximus in particular is the largest muscle in the entire body. But we also will see the tensor fasciae latae. This is one unique gluteal muscle that is actually more viewable from the anterior side of the thigh. Both the gluteus maximus and the gluteus medius are viewed from the posterior side of the body. You can see this muscle is showing us the gluteus maximus, and this muscle over here is the gluteus medius. As this is the largest muscle in the body, naturally it's going to be attached to some very large tendons too. The gluteus medius is a little bit bigger than it's shown on this picture, however the gluteus maximus is covering it up. This is a picture from the posterior side of the body, but when we rotate the body around, we can now start to see the tensor fasciae latae. So you'll actually just see the gluteus medius muscle projecting out here just ever so slightly. Right next to this is the tensor fasciae latae. The tensor fasciae latae attaches up here at the ilium bone and will eventually also have this tendon which will course all the way down to the knee. One corny little way to remember the tensor fasciae latae is that this is the perfect location to rest your latte when your arm gets tired. Hopefully that little trick helps you to remember this one. Just as with the muscles of the upper arm, the muscles of the gluteal region are fairly straightforward as well. The muscles of the upper leg tend to be a little bit more involved than the muscles of the gluteal region or the muscles of the upper arm. So in particular, the upper leg can be separated into 3 groups. The first group is the anterior portion, which can be seen here. We also have what's known as the adductor group, which are all shown right here. And we also have the muscle on the posterior side of the leg also. So let's first dive into the muscles of the anterior leg, which are shown right here. So we have the sartorius muscle, the rectus femoris muscle, and our 3 vastus muscles, the vastus lateralis, vastus medialis, and vastus intermedius. Let's see what these 5 muscles look like on the body. In particular, from this view, we can actually see both the anterior muscles and the adductor group. So these here are showing us the anterior muscles, and the adductor group is found over here. The anterior group in particular is comprised of the sartorius, the rectus femoris, and our 3 vastus muscles. Our muscles of interest are on the left side of the page. So this muscle here is known as the sartorius. And the sartorius courses also in the same direction as the external oblique did, from superior lateral to inferior medial. The sartorius is the longest muscle in the entire body. But the sartorius is probably the most unique out of all of the muscles of the leg. Below the sartorius is where we'll have our rectus femoris, vastus lateralis, vastus medialis, and vastus intermedius muscle. In particular, on the anterior and posterior sides of the legs, we have special names that we give to these groups of muscles. On the anterior sides of the legs, we have what are known as the quadriceps. The rectus femoris, vastus lateralis, vastus medialis, and vastus intermedius are the 4 muscles that make up what are known as the quadriceps. So make sure that you make a note that it is these 4 muscles that are the quadriceps, and the sartorius lays just on top of them. Once we've removed the sartorius and also gotten the tensor fasciae latae out of the way, we'll really nicely be able to see the rectus femoris muscle. This is going to be the largest muscle of the anterior thigh. The rectus femoris inserts down here at the patella. This is the largest of the quadriceps muscle. We can also see from this picture the vastus medialis and the vastus lateralis. The vastus medialis is named because it is the most medial of the vastus muscles. The vastus lateralis, on the other hand, is of course named because it's the most lateral of our vastus muscles. And the vastus intermedius muscle will be the smallest of our quadriceps, and it will sit right in between, intermediate to, the vastus medialis and the vastus lateralis. We can see on this picture, we've got the vastus medialis muscle here, more medially positioned, and the vastus lateralis shown over here, which is laterally positioned. And then the vastus intermedius is intermediate to the vastus medialis and the vastus lateralis. You can only see the vastus intermedius once the rectus femoris has been removed. So if you see the rectus femoris and you see the sartorius, you know for a fact that we are not looking at the vastus intermedius. So truly, the muscles of the anterior leg live up to their names. First and foremost, we have the quadriceps, and quad means four, so there are four of these muscles that make up the quadriceps. And then we'll also have the vastus group, which is going to be named based on their position in reference to each other. The sartorius will be the most superficial of all of them, but don't get this mixed up. The sartorius is not a quadriceps muscle. The three vastus muscles lay within the same plane as each other, and then the rectus femoris will lay on top of the three. So this will take us into our adductor muscles. We have the gracilis muscle, the pectineus, the adductor magnus, and the adductor longus. The adductor group tends to be a little bit more challenging, as all of these muscles are crammed in the same spot. But we can learn the adductor muscles based on the length of these muscles. So here we have the pectineus muscle, we have the adductor longus shown here, the adductor magnus is just ever so slightly seen right here between the adductor longus and the gracilis muscle, and then of course we have gracilis, which is going to be the most medial of all of the adductor muscles. Now based on the position of each of these muscles in the adductor group, we know that their action is going to be adduction. Because these muscles are positioned medially on the interior side of the leg, that's going to produce an adduction when those muscles contract. Essentially, this is what's going to pull the legs together and allow you to stand at attention. So once again, we've got the gracilis muscle shown here, the adductor magnus, the adductor longus, and the pectineus. The pectineus will be the shortest of all of the adductor muscles, and the gracilis will be the longest. In terms of the adductor longus and the adductor magnus muscle, these often get confused based on their names. Oftentimes, when a part of a muscle's name is longest, it means that it's a longer muscle than its neighbor. However, what we will see is the adductor longus is not the longest of the adductor muscle. In fact, the adductor magnus will be longer and larger than the adductor longus muscle. So there's a lot going on here at the anterior side of the leg. We have our four quadriceps, the sartorius, and we can also even see one of our gluteal muscles, the tensor fasciae latae. We've got four adductor muscles that get longer and longer as they move and attach further down the leg. Make sure that you're comfortable sorting these muscles into their respective groups. So if we have an adductor muscle, such as the pectineus, I want you to know that that's part of the adductor group. The vastus medialis, on the other hand, is one of our quadriceps. Those group names are very, very important. So our last group on the upper leg is the posterior group. The posterior group is often given the name the hamstrings, and there's only three hamstring muscles that can be found on the back side of the leg. They are the semimembranosus, the semitendinosus, and the biceps femoris. Truly, the hardest part of the hamstrings is pronouncing their names. Each of these hamstrings will course vertically and sit right next to each other. And I have a really nice little trick that you can use to remember where each of these muscles are found. This slide shows us the posterior side of the leg, and we can confirm that because we can see the gluteus maximus muscle shown right here. The gluteus maximus is only found on the posterior side of the body, so you can use that landmark to tell you that you're looking at the back side. Now, in regard to the hamstring muscles, you'll see the semimembranosus muscle shown here, the semitendinosus muscle shown here, and you'll also find the biceps femoris muscle down here. The biceps femoris muscle, hence its name, is going to indicate that this muscle also has two origins, just like the biceps brachii did. However, this muscle is found in the femoral region. That's why we call it the biceps femoris. So the biceps brachii muscle is found in the brachial region, the biceps femoris is found on the femoral region, and both muscles will have two origins. Now, in terms of the semimembranosus, the semitendinosus, and the biceps femoris as the hamstring group, it can be very easy to get all of these muscles mixed up, as they all look very similar here on the back side of the leg. So one little trick that you can use to remember where each of these muscles will sit is that the semimembranosus is the most medial. Medial starts with an M, and semimembranosus has an extra M in its name. So this M in semimembranosus is going to indicate that we are more medially located. Next to this is the semitendinosus. The semimembranosus and semitendinosus sound too similar and therefore are going to be next to each other. And the biceps femoris, which is our last muscle, therefore has to be the most lateral. A little trick here for the semitendinosus is the semitendinosus, which has a T in it, is intermediate, the other two hamstring muscles. Now from this view, we can also see the gluteus maximus, as I pointed out earlier. You see the gluteus medius over here, but you can also see this muscle shown right here. This is even more medially located than the semimembranosus, it would seem. This muscle in particular is the gracilis muscle. So this will actually be one of our adductor muscles that we will find better viewed from the front side of the body. So that's the one thing that you really want to be careful with back here on the back side of the leg, is that you want to account for the gracilis being in here also. As this is the most medial of all of the muscles here, that's going to be part of the adductor group that pulls the leg inward. And then here on the posterior side of the leg, we'll find the semimembranosus, the semitendinosus, and the biceps femoris muscles. So we only have 3 hamstrings, 3 gluteal muscles, and 3 muscles of the upper arm. The last 2 groups that we're going to be covering are the muscles of the forearm and the muscles of the lower leg. The forearm and the lower leg contain lots and lots of muscles. As we're starting to give rise to the parts of our body that are going to be able to produce more precise and fine muscle movements, we're going to have more muscles that are on average smaller to help facilitate these different movements. In all reality, the forearm actually contains about 20 different muscles, but we are only going to learn these 8. We can separate the forearm into an anterior group and a posterior group, and I like to throw a lateral group in there also. It helps us to visualize the forearm a little bit better. One thing that you're going to come to see about the forearm muscles is that there are lots of similarities in the way that they are named. For example, you can see that all of the muscles in the posterior group start with the word extensor. And you may have also noticed that 2 of the posterior group muscles and 2 of the anterior group muscles contain the word carpi. So the words that we use to name our forearm muscles will be very useful in helping you identify and understand the action of that particular muscle. This can be used to help you identify these skeletal muscles in particular. So the forearm is one place where I'll tell you once again that orientation is key. It can be very easy to confuse the front side of the arm with the back side of the arm. So we're first going to go over the landmarks that we will look for to identify either the front or the back side of the forearm. This picture shows us the posterior side of the forearm. One of the main things that we're going to look for is this long fan-like tendon of the triceps brachii muscle. This point here is showing us the elbow, and the elbow is clearly found on the posterior side of the arm. We can also see the triceps brachii muscle coming off here, and that's going to tell you you're looking at the back side. One of the other key markers that you can see here for the posterior side of the arm are the fingernails. We'll find the fingernails on this side, and fingernails are only found posteriorly. So we're definitely looking at the posterior side of the arm. This picture, on the other hand, shows us the anterior side of the arm. We no longer see that fan-like tendon, and in fact, we're going to see the insertion of the biceps brachii muscle. So you'll find this muscle found up here. You'll actually be able to see the biceps instead of the triceps. Since the biceps is found anteriorly, that's going to indicate that you're looking at the front side. However, one of the other things that you will also notice is that there's no fingernails on this side of the hand, and the tendons of these flexor muscles are going to be a lot longer. So you'll see these slender tendons on the front side, and you won't really see that much here on the back side. Hopefully those indicators will help you to identify whether you're looking at the posterior or the anterior side of the forearm. So this picture that we're looking at is the posterior side of the forearm. There are 3 muscles found on the posterior side, and they're all extensor muscles. They all begin with the word extensor. And the reason that these muscles are called extensor muscles is because they help for the extension of the hand. When these muscles contract, that shortens their length, and that extends the hands and the fingers outwards. All extensor muscles are found on the posterior side of the arm. So without a doubt, if you see the posterior side of the arm, you automatically want to start thinking about extensor muscles. Let's go from medial to lateral. This muscle over here is known as the extensor carpi ulnaris muscle. The extensor carpi ulnaris is an extensor muscle, and it will course down here and attach around the wrist. That's why it's called the extensor carpi muscle. But we also say that this is the extensor carpi ulnaris, and we need to distinguish that because we also will find an extensor carpi radialis. Both of these muscles are named very, very similarly. The only difference is in their last word. So in the anatomical position, the ulna is found more medially located. And we also know that the ulna is found on the pinky side of the hand. Therefore, this muscle is the extensor carpi ulnaris because it's the extensor muscle that attaches around the wrist area on the ulna side of the forearm. Over here we have our extensor carpi radialis muscle, which is going to be our extensor muscle. However, this is found on the radius side. Remember, the radius is found on the thumb side, so therefore the extensor carpi radialis will be more laterally positioned. Now, in between these two muscles, we have the extensor digitorum. The extensor digitorum muscle is found right here, and one way that we can know for sure that we're looking at the extensor digitorum is by following this tendon down to the digits. The extensor digitorum's action is to extend the digits in particular. So all 3 of these muscles are named based on their actions. One other side note that I just want to mention is the extensor carpi radialis muscle has 2 arrows here. So what could that mean? I've already mentioned that the forearm has about 20 muscles that can be found on it. There's 11 muscles on the back side of the arm, and there's 9 muscles that are found on the anterior side of the arm. This extensor carpi radialis muscle is indicating that there's actually 2 muscles that make this up. We have an extensor carpi radialis longus muscle and an extensor carpi radialis brevis muscle. You can see this one would be the brevis and this one would be the longus. I won't be asking you to distinguish either or, but if you do see 2 arrows, that's what that means. So we're turning the hand over and now looking at the anterior side of the forearm. We'll also see that there are 3 muscles on this part of the arm. But these are not extensor muscles, these are flexor muscles. So over here you can see we have the flexor carpi ulnaris, and over here we're going to have the flexor carpi radialis. They're flexor muscles because they flex the hand, and they're called carpi because they go down to the wrist. Just as we saw on the posterior side of the arm, this muscle is found on the pinky side, which makes it an ulnaris. So this is the flexor carpi ulnaris muscle. Over here, we'll find our flexor carpi radialis muscle, because this is on the thumb side, where the radius can be found. Now, in between these 2 muscles, we're not going to have a digitorum. Instead, we're going to have what's known as the palmaris longus. The palmaris longus has this very long tendon that comes over here and courses over this band of connective tissue known as the flexor retinaculum. You can also use this tendon in particular to help you identify whether or not you're looking at the front or the back side of the forearm. This tendon sits above this connective tissue band, and it travels out to the palm, so it's a very appropriate name to call this the palmaris longus muscle. So the first thing that you want to do when identifying the muscles of the forearm is determine whether or not you're looking at the front side or the back side. If you're looking at the back side, you know you're looking at an extensor group of muscles. If the picture is showing you the front side of the arm, you're looking at a flexor muscle. Depending on how close or far away you are from the radius or the ulna, that will also play a role in which muscle you're going to select. If we're close to the ulna, you'll pick ulnaris. If you're close to the radius, you'll pick the radialis. So these muscles are the 3 flexor muscles that can be found on the anterior side of the arm. Now we do have one more group on the forearm, which is the lateral group. The lateral group is found on the thumb side, which is why we call it the lateral group. There are 2 muscles in this lateral group, namely the brachioradialis muscle and the pronator teres muscle. The brachioradialis muscle can be seen right here. This is the largest of all of the forearm muscles. The brachioradialis gets its name because it comes over here to the radius, but it also originates up on the brachial region. The pronator teres, on the other hand, is going to be our smallest of these muscles, and you can see the pronator teres very nicely from the anterior view. The pronator teres, hence its name, is going to be the muscle that allows us to pronate our hands. So this picture in particular allows us to see how the anterior, lateral, and posterior groups of muscles will all sit with each other. Here on the posterior side, we have the two extensor carpi radialis muscles, and right next to that we'll have the brachioradialis muscle here. Moving more towards the anterior side, we'll find the pronator teres up here, and then the flexor carpi radialis right on the other side. So we've now seen that the muscles of the forearm are really named rather reasonably. The muscles on the posterior side are all going to extend the hand, so we call them all extensors. And based on the rest of the terms in each of these names, that's going to tell you what part of the hands these muscles are extending. In terms of the anterior group, we'll find our flexor muscles and the palmaris longus. All of these will in some way flex the hand. And the lateral group sits right in between these two muscles on the lateral side of the forearm. The lateral muscles are positioned in a V shape with each other. You can see the pronator teres and the brachioradialis form a shape of the letter V. This will be the largest of the forearm muscles, and the pronator teres will be the smallest of the forearm muscles. The last group of muscles that you will be responsible for are the muscles of the lower leg. There are 6 muscles below the knee that we'll be focusing on, and they are the tibialis anterior muscle, the extensor digitorum longus, the fibularis, also known as the peroneus muscle, the soleus, the gastrocnemius, and the flexor digitorum longus muscle. So let's jump right into identifying these muscles. So first and foremost, this muscle right in front is known as the tibialis anterior. The tibialis anterior is named because it sits anterior to the tibia. This bone is the tibia, which is always found more medially. Remember, the fibula is found more laterally. So the tibialis anterior is actually sitting in front of the tibia. And we'll see from a medial view how the tibialis anterior will project out in front of the tibia. As we move more laterally, we come to the extensor digitorum longus muscle. Now be very careful. We also had an extensor digitorum muscle up on the forearm. And the extensor digitorum and the extensor digitorum longus are 2 different muscles. Extensor digitorum longus is found down here on the leg. And you can identify this muscle as it's right next to the tibialis anterior, but you can also follow this tendon out to the digits as well. This will help in the action of dorsiflexion. Positioning the leg so that we can have a lateral view, you can also see the tibialis anterior and the extensor digitorum longus once again. These are the 2 muscles we've just seen. But even more laterally than the extensor digitorum longus is this muscle known as the fibularis, or the peroneus muscle. One way in particular that you can remember the fibularis muscle is the most lateral is that the fibula muscle is found more laterally down here on the leg. So the fibula will be very close to the fibularis muscle in particular. Now as we make our way to the back side of the leg, we have the soleus muscle and the gastrocnemius. The soleus will be the largest muscle on the lower leg, and it spans almost the entire length of the lower leg itself. Superficial to this, we'll find the gastrocnemius muscle, which is the muscle that makes the calf look as though it's protruding. You can also see from a medial view how the gastrocnemius and the soleus muscles will sit. The gastrocnemius is always superficial to the soleus. And even though it's going to look a little smaller from this view, we can still see it from the medial side of the leg. You know that this is the medial side because we have the tibia shown here. And this is the view where we can actually see the tibialis anterior right in front of the tibia. The last muscle that we have here on the lower leg is the flexor digitorum longus. The flexor digitorum longus is going to facilitate plantar flexion of the foot. This is going to help to curl the toes. And you can see that this tendon is going to course under the foot and eventually cause the toes to curl. So we'll find that muscle shown here. One other thing I want to mention about the gastrocnemius muscle is that this muscle in particular inserts with the Achilles tendon. This very, very large tendon will come down here and insert into the calcaneus bone, which we will talk more about in the next presentation. You can also see a couple muscles up here in this picture that we've already discussed. This muscle in particular is the vastus medialis muscle, and we also have a little bit of view of the sartorius muscle that's wrapping around the leg in this position. So once you will have gotten these 6 muscles down for the lower leg, you'll have learned all of the muscles that I will have for you in this class. So in review, the tibialis anterior sits right in front of the tibia. It is positioned most anteriorly of all of these muscles. As we move more laterally, we'll find the extensor digitorum longus, which will help us to extend the digits. Remember, the extensor digitorum longus and the extensor digitorum are 2 different muscles found in 2 different places. The fibularis muscle is the most lateral, and we can remember that because the fibula is positioned more laterally also. As we move towards the back, we have the soleus muscle, which is the largest muscle of the lower leg, and the gastrocnemius muscle that sits right on top or superficial to the soleus. The gastrocnemius inserts with the Achilles tendon, and one thing I didn't mention is that this muscle actually has 2 heads, and its 2 origins will be on the femur. We'll talk about that in the next presentation also. We'll also find the flexor digitorum longus, which aids in plantar flexion of the foot. This will conclude our presentation on skeletal muscle identification. You'll find this exam review tacked on to the end of your PowerPoint slides. I encourage you to use the slides posted in the exam review so that you can use these pictures to identify all of the muscles that will be on your exam. I've posted pictures for all of your muscles in here so you can go through these at your own pace. You're going to be tasked with skeletal muscle identification. You'll have to know where all of our muscles are found. So make sure that you feel very comfortable about skeletal muscle identification before you take the quiz, and always be sure to reach out if I can be of any assistance at all. In our next lab video, we will cover the individual origins, insertions, and actions of some of these muscles that we can now identify.